So good morning, everyone. For those of you in the morning time zone, for others it may be a little bit later in the day. I know our first slide says we'll begin promptly at 11, but there are a few people still trickling in, so we were kind of giving another extra minute. So welcome everyone to our third of this 3 webinar series on creating rights of way, pollinator habitat along rights of way. The other 2 have been recorded and are available on our website as well. If anybody hadn't joined those and wants to listen into them, the recording is found there. The best place to look is if you Google CWF webinars, you'll find a page that way, and you'll be able to see the other 2 as well as other webinars that that CWF has recorded and has available to the public. So that's the best place to look. There's also the link to some of the work that we're doing as well. You can see on the first slide here as well. So I'm James Paget. I'm with Canadian Wildlife Federation. I'm a species risk and biodiversity specialist. So I'm not a tech person necessarily, but I'm going to be hosting this webinar. So I'm just going to go through some of the housekeeping stuff, and I'll tell you a little bit about CWF to lead into this. So what we're going to do is the audio settings. First of all, if you're having any difficulties with audio, that's what we're going to use the chat for, as opposed to asking questions. First, obviously, the first thing to check is make sure your headphones or speakers are being enabled to allow the audio to come through. There's a drop down arrow beside the mute button and the video. If you have any troubles with that, you can always check those to check your settings. So yeah, the chat we're going to use if you're having any audio problems, if you're not hearing us properly, if you're not seeing the video, you can send that straight to us, and I'll try and see if I can help troubleshoot. What we're going to do is we're going to use the Q&A that's found at the bottom as well to answer questions. So we're going to try and hold all the questions to the end unless there's like something specific that needs clarification, but you can write them in at any time because we'll be browsing through, and there's a few of us on that can maybe answer questions as we go and post that for everyone to see the answers. But we can also bring them up at the end to discuss as the group and answer as a group. So anytime a question comes up, feel free to type it in the Q&A at the bottom, and we'll address it either right away by writing back or at the end as we have our Q&A session later on. So a little bit about CWF. We're one of Canada's largest conservation organizations. We undertake a number of conservation projects and education projects across the country. Our mission is to conserve and inspire the conservation of Canada's wildlife and habitats. And we do this in a number of ways. So one of which is engaging public and the youth and citizen science, things like iNaturalist Canada, through our education programs as well, like Wild Outside and our Canadian Conservation Corps. And then specific projects, we have a number of projects in freshwater, marine, and terrestrial environment, many of which target species at risk, like the right whale, Blanding's turtle, at-risk bats, and the monarch butterfly, which ties into this current project on restoring pollinator habitat on rights of way, which dovetails well. So I'll turn that over to Victoria to talk about that project.
Thank you, James. Okay, so if we go to the next slide there, that would be great. Wonderful. So hi, everyone. My name is Victoria, and I am the Habitat Program Manager for the Rights of Way project at CWF. So just as James introduced, this is the 3rd webinar of our 3-part Pollinator Winter Webinar Series. We had 2 wonderful webinars that took place in January as well as February, as you can see on the screen, and they are recorded and are available online for you to take a look at if you didn't get to see them. And we are also recording this webinar. So if you do need to leave early, that's okay. Or if you'd like to review something that is shared, you can do that too after the webinar. And I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the Rights of Way project on the next slide. So to give you a brief introduction, the Rights of Way is habitat restoration program. Well, what we're doing is we're collaborating with rights of way managers. So that includes hydro corridors, pipelines, solar fields, as well as roadways of municipalities. And we are working to restore breeding and migratory habitat for monarchs, but other benefiting pollinator species as well. And so rights of way provide a really unique opportunity to conduct this restoration because there's mutually beneficial components. And I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our team. So this isn't our whole team, but it's who we have here with us today. Of course, James, who is a species at risk and biodiversity specialist. And today he's wearing a second hat of our MC. We also have Carolyn Callahan, who's our senior conservation biologist. And she has really been the one who spearheaded this project over the last few years and has brought us to where we are today. We have myself, as well as Tracy Atwell, who's our restoration ecologist, and she provides really key technical expertise to all aspects of the project. We also have our partners. So partners that we're doing on the ground restoration work with within Eastern Ontario include Lanark County as well as Hydro One. And we're looking to expand our partners, which I'll talk about more in just a moment. And then also we receive funding support from Ontario Trillium Foundation. And without them, this project really wouldn't be possible. So on the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit more about how you can be involved in this project and a little bit more on the ins and outs. So one of the really key components of this project is the development of a network. And so we actually have two networks that we're developing. And one of them is for Eastern Ontario Rights of Way managers. So through Ontario Trillium Foundation, we are able to offer these opportunities to those who are in the Rideau, Kingston, Quinte area. And we're developing a communities of practice networking group, and you can join that on our webpage. And we're also building the Canadian chapter of the Rights of Way Habitat Working Group. And that's in collaboration with our US counterparts who already have a really established network there. And the whole idea for these networks is to provide peer-to-peer knowledge sharing opportunities. So whether that's through the provision of resources, networking opportunities, maybe webinars like this as well, that's what we're really hoping for. We are also organizing and facilitating other peer-to-peer technical training opportunities. So that includes webinars like this, but also eventually one day in-person training for our Eastern Ontario partners, and also workshops. So we have an annual workshop that is coming up beginning on March 23rd. And this is a 5-session workshop with each session being 90 minutes in length, and it's going to be held across 3 weeks. So we really wanted to create something that was flexible, that would, work within your work schedules or your other commitments. So each session is of a completely unique topic. So we do encourage you to join all, but if you're not able to, that's okay. You can just choose the ones you're available to go to. And you can find more about that workshop at that link below, or just by searching the CWF webpage. And this is a great opportunity to learn more about our project, how you can be involved, and to gain a lot more resources. There's going to be sessions that talk about funding opportunities to start your own initiatives. There's going to be opportunities to learn more about projects that are already taking place in Canada, as well as more on the technical components, the techniques for field work. And finally, we conduct actual on-the-ground restoration with our partners. And as I said, we are focused in Eastern Ontario. We're currently partnering with Lanark County as well as Hydro One, but we hope to expand that. So if you are interested in learning more about how to become a partner, please do send me an email and we can connect on that. And without further ado, on the next slide, I would like to introduce our speaker for today. Wonderful, thank you. So today here we have Brittany Dobrzynski, and Brittany is a stewardship project coordinator with the New Jersey Audubon, serving southern New Jersey. And she graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in Wildlife and Conservation Biology from the University of Rhode Island. And that's where she began her career. And she was assisting with a native seed collection propagation program. And so she joined the Audubon in 2015, where she works to manage and maintain habitat on private lands. And she's also a conservation planner with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And there she consults with agriculture producers to protect soil and water resources. And in addition, she oversees the New Jersey Audubon's Healthy Land and Waters Grant, and that provides financial assistance and planning for habitat enhancement projects. So I am going to pass things over to Brittany. And we'll just give Brittany a moment to share her screen.
All right. Are you seeing everything okay?
Everything looks great.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that great introduction. So happy to be here with you today, talking about how land managers can create pollinator habitat. Serving as the Stewardship Project Coordinator, we work with landowners throughout Southern New Jersey. We service 6 different counties. And as Victoria mentioned, I work with the Department of Agriculture to do some conservation planning with agricultural producers, forested landowners, and also we've been working with some municipalities to get some of this work off the ground. So let's get into it. Before we dive in, just wanted to give you a quick background on New Jersey Audubon. We are made up of several different departments that help to deliver our mission, those being research, education, government relations, and I am coming to you from the Stewardship Department, where we work with landowners, farmers, and other stakeholders to do restoration projects throughout the state. Being a small nonprofit, we have a mighty staff of 4 full-time employees in the southern portion. So we really lean on and utilize our partners for some assistance and to help drum up some business for us. We are supported fully by grants where we work to provide technical and financial assistance to folks that are doing this type of work. So it's a very fitting role that I'm serving to you here today. In 2017, our government relations, who works largely with legislators to try and lobby for bills that we're interested in passing, actually worked with transportation authorities where a bill was passed to exclusively utilize native plants in restoration efforts. And since then, we've been providing assistance to vegetate roadsides with native plants that provide a suite of benefits to wildlife by enhancing transportation corridors for people as well as wildlife. So a big niche that we're trying to fill and lots of space available. So I'm not going to get too deep into pollinator biology, but there are a few take-home notes that I want to hit on before we dive in. In North America alone, we have over 5,000 species of native bees, and this does not account for additional pollinator species like our insects, moths, butterflies, and birds that are using this habitat as well. Our focus is on providing a suite of resources, not just nectar and pollen, but those that will get these animals through their entire life cycle. So including overwintering sites and native host plants. So not only are we focusing on protecting our pollinators for the important ecosystem service of crop pollination, but we're also providing habitat to a number of beneficial insects that can compete with pests and manage vegetation. So there's certain species that feed exclusively on certain species of plants, keeping them in check, and also providing resources to wildlife. And it also supports those charismatic species like the monarch butterfly, hummingbirds, and of course the bumblebees. A big focus of my ag work is supplying resources to honeybees. So farmers who have hives on site, but maybe don't have any crops that are blooming throughout the season, we want to give those early resources to the bees to be able to get things started in the spring. Studies also show that native bee species are actually better suited for pollination of certain crops, including those within the squash family. They're just better suited biologically to get into those flowers and do a better job than some of our honeybee species, which are actually of European descent. So really providing for all. Native bees are active earlier in the day and are especially adapted with pollen carrying appendages, and again, supporting thousands of important species, not only important for crop pollination, but for pollinating our native plants and carrying through their life cycle as well. Unfortunately, we've seen drastic declines worldwide, a 25% decline in pollinators over the last 30 years. So quite a staggering number of species that are not getting the resources that they need to make it through. So it's alarming, it's concerning, and we're always looking for opportunities to support these animals. Roadsides and rights-of-ways are an obvious place to start. We have over 17 million acres of roadsides alone in the US. And so that can help with the species that are in risk of extinction. So I mentioned before, providing habitat for pollinators means providing animals with resources as a suite of species to get them through their entire life cycle. The biology of these pollinators is important to know. So 70% of our native bees are actually ground nesters. So they need bare ground to be able to access that resource to build their nurseries and tunnels underground and provide for young. So bare ground is actually an important component of some of this wildlife habitat. 30% of species nest above ground in tunnels or stems. They utilize pithy stems, trees, small crevices, cavities in trees, even snail shells and things that you might not consider. I included this awesome photo of a leafcutter bee's nest where they have actually taken leaves and created this structure to overwinter and raise young. Bumblebees are colonial and they nest opportunistically in insulated cavities, which can range from brush piles to rodent holes to overgrown areas. And so considering these overwintering sites is an important component of planning for your pollinator habitat and requires special consideration when you're thinking about things like your maintenance schedules and how to go about creating this habitat and maintaining it for years to come. And so here's just a list of some of the things that we're considering. A variation in habitat structure. So a lot of people think pollinator habitat, they think wildflower meadows, but we also love to incorporate some woody vegetation, some grasses, and again, native host plants for the species that really rely on a particular plant. Some butterflies and moths, the best example of this is the monarch butterfly, who its young can only feed on milkweed species. So there's a suite of species that fall into those categories, all with their own unique host plants that are important to consider. And just another feature of having variation on the landscape that allows for the use from these animals. So a water source or proximity to a water source is also sort of important. So what does pollinator habitat look like? It can be so variable across the landscape, and we'll get into kind of the specifics of how to determine the best plant material to use for the job. But it really serves as this umbrella term, and that's the part that I really want to drive home to folks. So we're thinking about pollinators, but we're also providing for a number of wildlife species. And so in that, we want to really provide this variability on the landscape. We're going to be providing species that bloom throughout the year. So starting in early spring here in New Jersey, we've had high 60s the last couple of days, which is super exciting. And we've been seeing some insects moving around, and even those annual provide some nectar pollen sources in the early seasons. The second photo here is kind of like a stream bank stabilization project. I don't know if you're familiar with Phragmites in your area, but problem down in the coastal regions of southern New Jersey. And so compete some of those invasive species by replanting flowers and nectar sources much earlier than some of our herbaceous plants when they are getting going. And here's a couple of examples of what pollinator habitat might look like along roadsides. So again, the plant communities that you're utilizing are going to differ depending on your existing site conditions and conservation needs. But the overall theme here is to provide a mosaic of habitats. So we have a couple of different methods for this. The first being creating a feathered edge. So when you think about roadsides, you often think about a hard mowed edge that may transition into a forested situation or a hedgerow. but really softening that edge and adding some tall perennial species or even some flowering shrubs is going to just make this habitat more useful. And this might be the easiest way to go about starting with a right-of-way project, is just looking at what you have existing, where you have room to actually fit these things in, and then kind of going from there. And we'll talk about plant material next. All right, sorry, I'm just having a... Another way that you can create some of this habitat if you have a limited space is really by incorporating those taller species with the shrubs and trees on an edge. You're building your habitat vertically. So instead of having to have a certain amount of road shoulder available, even just one line of flowering shrubs is going to provide a huge benefit to the pollinator habitat that's available. And really, we're looking to extend these corridors for wildlife.
Sorry, Brittany, you're cutting up a little bit. So I'm wondering, actually, maybe can you turn off your video for a bit to see if that helps your connection?
Yes. Do you need me to backtrack at all?
Maybe just that last kind of couple sentences that you had mentioned there, yeah.
Okay. Let me know.
We're hearing you good now.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Working from home problems. So I was just mentioning this bottom right picture. This is along the Atlantic City Expressway. So it's a very busy highway that gets folks from the city of Philadelphia down to Atlantic City or shore points, very heavily traveled in the summertime. But just utilizing that corridor has allowed for this expansive patch of pollinator habitat that once was simply mowed ground and had a lot of resources going into it from the municipality to direct folks to be constantly mowing and working through the typical maintenance schedule. So you'll see with some of this pollinator habitat, it's really more of a hands-off, reduced maintenance, and can create some cost savings over time. So we have a number of initial considerations when thinking about your project site, and those are really important for the success of your project. So even before you get to planning how you're going to maintain it, you need to think about the resources that you have as a land manager available to you. And so some projects could be very simply implemented by simply reducing your mowing schedule. The bottom right photo is some salvia that is just along an unmowed edge of road here in the county. And even just allowing some species or fields to grow up in what's naturally present is providing, like I mentioned, those early blooming, more weedy winter annuals that allow for some early habitat. So protecting existing habitat and also thinking in the future about the capability of maintaining a newly enhanced habitat and utilizing what's already there. And then thinking, of course, about the resources that you have available to you, maintenance crews, budgets for the year. Some of these seed mixes can be quite expensive. So you just really want to consider all of that ahead of time, including what equipment you might have available to you. In working with a lot of agricultural producers, we think about what they have at their disposal already, and then try to network and connect them with folks that may have a piece of equipment that another person does not have access to, and trying to get them to kind of share those resources as well. All right, so now we're going to get into the nitty gritty. So factors to consider when choosing your site. The first thing you want to do is look at the site history and existing conditions. So again, considering what's currently growing there. Do you have noxious or invasive weedy species that will need to be eradicated before planting this to native cover? Could reduced mowing schedules simply provide species diversity and allow for wildflower establishment with little cost inputs? Think about the composition of your weed species. So are they broadleaf? Are they perennial, annual, woody, or herbaceous? And then understanding the ecology of those species that are already there that you're going to need to manage before moving forward. We do a lot of invasive species eradication. I mentioned Phragmites earlier, but we have a ton of woody, viney species down here in Cape May County that do require some herbicide use in order to get a handle on them quickly and with the least amount of inputs. You're also going to want to consider, what are your soils like? How is the drainage? This is going to inform you the plants that you can use for restoration of this site. Also, in working with agricultural producers, we consider the historic land use. So what current management tools are being utilized at the site? If it's a piece of ground that has been in an annually cultivated cropping situation, we might have less weed competition to deal with than, say, a field that's been fallow for 30 years that has all kinds of weedy species that we don't want to see. Also consider site accessibility and ease of access. You're going to need some equipment in some situations to prepare the site and to periodically access for maintenance. This is concentrated more toward the first year of establishment and then less and less each following year. But is it a site that's easily accessible? Is it hard to get to? Can you only access it at certain parts of the year because it's super wet, or the opposite? And also considering additional needs for the habitat. So if it's a very wet site, do you need to consider controlling stormwater flow or protecting the ground? Is it going to be detrimental to have a period of bare soil? All things that before planning your project need to be considered first. And then I mentioned herbicide use. You could consider some alternatives to a pesticide or herbicide program, including mechanical removal, but noting here that herbicide really can be a useful management tool. And you can use it for both like wide scale clearing of an area or just utilizing it for spot treatments along the way. Once you've hammered out all those details, which seem to be a very long list, you will be ready to start with your site preparation. And so this is really the most important piece of the puzzle when putting together a new restoration project. It's going to vary depending on your existing conditions and the amount of resources available, but there are a lot of options. It may take up to a full growing season or more to prepare the area, but that's just another piece that you're considering when thinking about the timing of these projects. So typically what we do is there's kind of two scenarios that I have depicted here. And the first one is on an agricultural field in Salem County, New Jersey, where the farmer plants a rye cover crop, and that gives them added soil health benefits throughout the year. But in this situation, he's herbicided the crop or burned it down, as we say, and we have a specialized seeder here called a Truax drill, which can actually penetrate through that plant material, and it will act as a mulch to actually protect the seedlings as they're coming up. And then the bottom example is a fresh tilled seed bed, completely devoid of any vegetation that's going to compete. So really your site preparation is going to depend on your existing conditions. A low mow may be adequate in some situations. You want to use a non-selective, non-persistent herbicide if you're going that route. Glyphosate is one that we use because it does not stay active in the soil. And we always try to strive for shallow cultivation. So I did say tillage, but really what I meant was, a very shallow till or disking where you're only disturbing kind of the top couple of inches of soil and not bringing up any weed seed that may be buried deep, and that's going to allow it to germinate. And that's why these preparations can take up to a full calendar year to get it ready, because you're going to be doing repeated treatments. So if you're going the mechanical route, disking, turning the soil slightly, you're going to have a whole new flush of weed seeds that are going to germinate, and you're going to have to address those again before getting planted. Of course, we're going to avoid any bee toxic herbicides like paraquat or gramoxone. And if you don't want to do any soil disturbance, you don't want to use herbicide, you can always do solarization. This is more beneficial in really smaller scale projects. We're only doing, 100 square feet or whatever's feasible, but this is using UV stabilized plastic to kind of lay it down. You're going to put some soil on top to hold it in place and leave that in place for 6 weeks or more to kill all the vegetation before getting in and planting. And again, depending on what species you have there currently, it could take much longer. Once your site is prepped, or maybe while you're going through the preparation phases, then you get to the fun part, which is the plant selection. You're gonna go for a mix of plants that are locally adaptive and native to your soil types and your climate. And so this is kind of the biggest piece of working with natives. Site appropriate, you want to consider sunlight and soil moisture, as well as what plant material is most appropriate for the site. And so this could be considering between woody or herbaceous plants. You want to focus on providing, again, that blooms throughout the entire growing season. So some early species that are blooming around here would be columbine or coreopsis, and then your later species are something like goldenrods and asters. When we plan a pollinator habitat through NRCS, we look at incorporating a minimum of 3 species per bloom period. So that's, again, early spring, mid to late summer, and then fall. And really, to hit all these points, the more plants or plant material that you incorporate, like mentioning the shrubs that bloom super early, are going to get you closer to that goal of 3 species per bloom period. The focus is providing nectar in the spring all the way through the fall. And then in the fall, you'll get, if you're using some woody vegetation, you'll get those great fruits and seed set that birds and other wildlife can utilize. We also incorporate warm season grasses into most of our plantings. This provides some habitat structure and also helps to provide those bare ground spaces in between some of these plants that are coming up. Oops. So again, I hope I'm preaching to the choir about utilizing native and perennial resources. Again, they're serving as a host plant for native insect species, well adapted to our local soils and climate, and providing for all wildlife species. This can also be beneficial because as they're going through their life cycle, they are producing seed and seeding themselves in and continuing to kind of grow and expand. Natives are also very important to consider that they are in line with the natural insect phenology throughout the region, right? So we're having them blooming at times when it's most beneficial to these insects and providing resources year round. They're also very deeply rooted species and they benefit the soil. They hold it in place, reducing runoff and increasing infiltration and water uptake. And they're pretty hardy. And so one note on seeding with native species is that it takes a little bit for them to go through their own life cycle. So we use the terms sleep, creep, and leap. So in the first year, you may see a couple of species starting to germinate and grow. They're spending a lot of time focusing on producing that deep root system and producing basal leaves. The second year, you'll see a couple more species coming in. And then by the third, everything leaps. It's going to be your peak bloom period. You're hopefully going to see all the species that you put in your mix germinating and doing their thing. But it really takes some patience. So just a note, if you do not see great establishment in the first year, just hang on because more is coming. And so here's where we'll talk about establishing a site from seed. So again, site preparation, super important. You don't want to set yourself up for failure where you're going to have a lot of weeds and competing for resources. And we use kind of two different methods, either broadcasting or drilling. Again, this is a close-up on the right of our True Axe drill, which actually has a couple of different seed boxes to incorporate different sized seed. And if you're broadcasting, you want to increase your seeding rate by 50%. Typically, our seeding rates that we're using are between 4 and 6 pounds per acre, which you may think, wow, that's really low, and you're going to have a lot of that bare ground. But of course, that's on purpose. We want to have the bare ground available. We want to leave room for species to seed themselves in and expand over time. So we've got fresh seed being set each year, and also some flowers that propagate by vegetative growth. So we want to leave enough room so that things don't become stagnant. Broadcast seeders or hand broadcasting, if a small scale, are inexpensive and easy to use, but they require that smooth seed bed. And I always tell folks to work in batches. So starting out, you know, maybe you start with a small amount of seed and then you're checking to make sure all the seed is getting incorporated. And so this is happening in early spring, pretty much now till mid-April. We really say everything should be in by June, but again, we're having such great weather now that it's good to get these things in early and allow them to kind of soak in those spring rains that come. And kind of, even if we sometimes plant seed in late fall, so we're looking at like November, December, we don't have terrible hard frosts that really affect our ability to plant late in the winter. And so a lot of times it's up to when we can get to it, but there's an option for that as well. The most important is seed to soil contact. So again, the True Axe drill is getting those seeds 1/4 to 1/2 inch inside the soil. And then broadcasting, when we're getting it in early, we're allowing the seed to kind of work itself into the soil. So it's important not to bury the seed. They really only need 1/4 to 1/2 inch. And so one way that you can achieve this is once seed is broadcast, you can kind of roll over that with either a cultipacker or even dragging a section of chain link fence behind a tractor to lightly incorporate this seed. There's also an option for frost seeding. So broadcasting the seed on top of snow and allowing the snow melt to kind of carry it down. Of course, that's going to have its own challenges and considerations in and of itself. You don't want to be doing that on a heavy slope area to carry the seed off site. But that's pretty much establishing from seed. And just a quick note, this graphic shows kind of the difference in seed size throughout the species. So this is a typical mix that we would use. We've got our 12 species that are going to bloom throughout the year, but you'll see they're all different sizes and seed weights. And so the benefit of ordering your seed unmixed is that you can kind of batch them together based on what's going to go out in a similar seed size. So if you're broadcasting, think about the opening on the broadcast seeder that's going to allow these guys to come out. If you're mixing them all together, that light seed might come out first in one big spot, but you really want it to spread evenly. And so by using an inert carrier like sand or kitty litter will really help to improve the ballistics and make sure that the seed is moving as far as you want it to. This is where it also comes in handy to have someone that can kind of walk behind the seeder and see where things are landing and how they're getting distributed. Transplanting is another wonderful option. Again, this is going to depend on your site and the size and feasibility. We love to utilize our volunteer base to do some transplanting projects, and it can actually be quite cost effective as well. If you get bare root material that is dormant from nurseries, you may pay $1 a piece, or if you're getting plugs through a wholesale nursery, you may be able to find some cost savings there. I didn't mention that the seed cost, we typically look between $700 to $1,000 an acre on the seeding cost. Of course, that can be adjusted to fit your budget, but these transplantings in smaller areas may be much better, and of course don't require as intense site prep. So if you're using herbaceous plugs, you would want to space things about 3 feet apart. And then for woody material, we go from 8 to 10 feet spacing. Of course, we want to protect them from deer browse. So the bottom right is going to show you some of the tree shelters that we use. Here in Cape May, we really don't have a ton of deer that are actively browsing our restoration sites, but in some other areas of New Jersey, we need to use 5 or 6 foot shelters to really protect those seedlings until they are past the height that they would be affected by buck rub, or if we're going in there to maintain around the shelters with herbicide, it's great to protect them from that as well. And it gives you that other option of, you know, a maintenance activity that you can do while your shrubs are establishing. And so the important tips are, you know, keeping the weed competition down around the establishing plants. And with transplants, you may need to use some irrigation just to get the plants established. That's just in the first couple weeks. But again, if you're timing it with, you know, the local weather patterns and getting it in before the heavy spring rains, you should be in a good place. A lot of folks say with plant restoration, plant it and they will come, where that is true, but it also requires maintenance and it is a waiting game. You cannot be hands off quite until you see the establishment that you want. And so this could require multiple mowings in the first year. Again, I mentioned if you're planting from seed, you're going to have species that are starting to germinate ahead of others. But having the ability to get in there with a mower that you can raise and lower to avoid the native plants that are establishing and just hit the weeds before they set seed is a big game changer. So in the first year, you may mow 2 or 3 times, just that high mow, trying to get those weeds from setting seed. And then in years after that, you really only need to mow maybe every 2 or 3 years to keep the woody species out if your goal is a perennial wildflower meadow. We also are a big fan of utilizing prescribed burning. So we work with the Forest Fire Service to try and maintain some of these plantings. It's quick, it's effective, and it actually provides an opportunity for these plants to get more vigorous over time. If you're burning off the top of the vegetation, you're allowing these roots to kind of set much deeper. But that requires, you know, more knowledge of how your species are going to react to that. Of course, we try to stick to spot treatments if we fall within the grassland bird nesting season. But after that period, we can really do a maintenance mow on the entire area. I also said to manage only 30% at a time, and this is because you're leaving resources in the rest of the area you're not devoiding the entire site of vegetation, you're kind of cycling through. Mentioning earlier that we work with landowners quite often, a majority of those being farmers, and on working lands, we're always trying to sneak native plants in for additional conservation benefits. And so here's some of the ways that we can address soil and water resource concerns while still getting good habitat on the ground. Windbreaks and hedgerows are a great possibility for getting more natives in. A lot of folks love to use arborvitae or Leland cypress, something that's evergreen and hardy, but we do have some native alternatives that we can use as well. I mentioned the deep rooting of native perennials, so that helps with erosion control, critical area plantings, trying to stabilize waterways or create a buffer where any soil erosion is kind of running through this vegetated strip before entering any kind of waterway or stream. And then they also can provide kind of as a natural snow fence in some situations, which could be helpful for land managers on right-of-ways in considering what kind of plant material to use. It also goes back to leaving the plant material until late winter. We talked about how bees are nesting in the above ground pithy stems. So not only are you allowing them to complete their lifestyle, but you're also getting this additional benefit of the snow fence as well. Some challenges and considerations that we have ran into over the years is the maintenance schedules and getting that correct. So it'd be very easy to stick a date on the calendar and say, oh, I'm gonna mow at this time, but you really want to know what's going on in your site. So site visit beforehand can be really important. Keeping up with that as the site is establishing, knowing how weedy it's getting, and if you need to do a maintenance mow during establishment, important to keep an eye on that. You are using mostly perennial vegetation, but you certainly can sneak in some annuals. I started with farmers that are implementing pollinator habitat, kind of throw in some cosmos in the mix for that instant gratification of, you know, a pretty benign annual that isn't going to take over the area, but certainly considering that as well. And also in some situations, we've used a nurse crop of oats. So putting down the nurse crop, then seeding into it just to hold all the soil in place and allow for some added conservation benefits. We're doing mostly dormant season seeding, which is so counterintuitive to a lot of folks that are doing annual plantings every year. Getting this in late winter, early spring, that is helping that seed isn't going to germinate and then be killed by a hard frost. It's going to kind of work its way into the soil and go through that natural stratification process with the freezes and thaws. And so we also want to consider aggressive versus invasive plants. So one plant that maybe you guys will laugh about is that Canada goldenrod here in southern New Jersey has a tendency to really take over an area. And so we've started removing some of that or putting it in at very low seeding rates when we're doing a restoration project. And so I'm sure that there are species similarly that you can think of that maybe you don't want to take over the area, so you may consider just a much lower seeding rate of that particular species so that it doesn't become a problem. So yes, that was like a very, very quick crash course in pollinator establishment. There are so many wonderful resources out there. The Jersey Society for Invertebrate Conservation comes to mind with conservation guides, they have plant recommendations, they have seeding rates, they have guides that will literally walk you through every step of the process and provide some alternatives. And they also have some case studies and best management practices. They have a whole publication on rights of way management. And so I would encourage you to check them out and kind of search through their library for some resources in this project. Wildflower.org can go through kind of every plant species that you can think of, tell you the growing conditions, the beneficial insects that are using it, and kind of their bloom period. So that can help you with putting together your mix. And of course, CWF has some wonderful resources on their website. This is a link to their plant encyclopedia, which I found really fascinating, but I'm sure they have lots of other great links that are available to you as well. And so that's going to come to the end of my presentation. More than happy to take any questions or hear about what you guys are experiencing. And yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I'll turn it back to some questions.
Great, thanks so much, Brittany. That was excellent. Lots of great info in there, and yeah, lots of good questions coming through. So maybe if you don't mind putting it back to just your past slide that has those resources, it might be useful for people to have a look at as we have questions. Thanks. So we have about 10 minutes, and we can ask questions of Brittany, but also some of our, like Carolyn and Victoria and Tracy are also available to chat about our Ontario project as well, and some of the Canadian settings as well. One that's come up that I should mention is about whether this is going to be available. And so the presentation, there's a recording will be available on, there was a link that Carolyn put into the chat that everybody can see. The presentation itself though, I don't think we typically make those available. So, but you can see all the slides through the video that way. Also, maybe CWF does have some other resources, obviously, in our pollinators webpage as well, beyond our native plant encyclopedia. So maybe Carolyn or Victoria or Tracy, you can pop that into the chat as well, so that people can follow those links, follow up on those later. So maybe I'll start in with, so we have some great questions here that have been typed in to the Q&A. And one actually that's come up in a few past webinars as well is this idea is asking, is there a concern that creating pollinator habitat near roadsides where there's vehicles passing through, is there a concern of that it might attract the pollinators to a potentially dangerous situation where they could be hit by cars along the roads? And maybe if you want to try, Brittany, if you're answering, you could put your video back on too to see if that for connection's good.
Okay, I do have my video on. Are you seeing me?
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, this is a really important consideration and something that I think about a lot. In speaking with Kelly Gill, who's our kind of resident pollinator specialist, the Jersey Society did do a study on this, and they actually found that the roadside mortality is not statistically significant. So I think the amount of mortality that they were seeing was so low that they really weren't concerned about it, because the benefits of having those resources available outweigh any collisions that could occur. I think the important piece to consider there is creating these as wildlife corridors, and so not just having one small patch on the side of the road and then another maybe directly across from it where they would have to travel back and forth, but really having the suite of resources that they need to complete their whole life cycle on one side, and allowing them to move back and forth between, you know, one shoulder of the road. And if we're hitting all of our points of providing all those resources throughout the whole life cycle, they should be pretty happy to kind of stick in that area. But yeah, I can't remember the number off the top of my head. I want to say it was like less than 10% of mortality that they were seeing. There is a great resource on the Xerces page on that. I think they go through the whole study.
Great, thanks. A couple of people mentioned that they missed, I think it was when video cut out a little bit, what you were talking about Phragmites. We were talking about stream bank restoration. Can you just mention that again? Phragmites is a big problem, especially in Eastern Ontario or throughout here.
Yeah, Phragmites is a huge issue. It has encroached on a lot of our restoration projects. And so I was kind of showing an example of where we did a Phragmites restoration. And so the best success that we have had is cutting Phragmites when it's got all of its resources above ground. It's really focusing on producing seed and getting all of those resources up. And so that usually happens for us around the 4th of July. We try to cut Phragmites around the 4th of July. And then we do like a snip and drip, where we are utilizing herbicide to get down into the root systems and terminate that plant, and using kind of the least amount of herbicide possible. So they have those hollow pithy stems. And so we can actually drip herbicide right in there that's going to carry down through. And so we do our treatment usually around early September, when the resources are starting to return down to the bottom of the plant. And then we've also had some success in just immediately getting that spot revegetated and giving some competition to the Phragmites. So the photo that I had some shrubs planted in there that are colonial, and so they're spreading out from one single base, and we're having really great success there. But it is a year after year treatment beginning to try and get that under control.
Great, thanks. Another question that's come up is, and this has also come up in other presentations or webinars, is that how do you manage and deal with species at risk? So if they're already on site when you're looking at mowing or prepping the site, also are there certain species that are part of the seed mix as we're looking to attract, obviously certain pollinators that may be at risk?
Yeah. So certainly as part of that site evaluation, you want to do a thorough job of recognizing what is currently there, what's currently using it. If we have a rare or threatened plant, we definitely want to adjust our project accordingly. And so it might just be adjusting our maintenance schedules to allow for that plant to have the most resources and kind of letting it be. Thinking about at-risk species that we want to provide more resources for. So down here in New Jersey, a big initiative is providing habitat for the frosted elfin, which only utilizes a couple of native host plants. And so wild lupine and baptisia, which is like a false indigo, are the two native host plants. And so to handle that, we're trying to get those species in as many plantings as we can, just to create pockets of habitat wherever it's suitable. They really like sandy, quick draining soils. And so when we have a project in an area where that's appropriate, we try and throw that into the mix right off the bat. Of course, trying to support monarchs through incorporating milkweeds and their native host plants is really how we're addressing that. But of course, if you have a T&E species that is site specific, it's really going to be honing in on what the needs are for that species and really trying to maintain it.
Great. And maybe one last question before we turn it back over to Victoria to close out. Is about seed mix. Where is that sourced? Like, who supplies a seed mix, and who decides on the mix itself? Is it the township? Is it a partner organization like yourselves? How does that work?
I'm assuming this is going to be different in every area. Where I work, when we're working with a customer, we come up with the seed mix. Xerces is a big partner who has created a seeding kind of spreadsheet where you can put in your species of interest, and it kind of generates a list based off of how many seeds per square foot is in, or how many seeds per square foot you want to see of that species, or seeds per pound. I use a source called Ernst Conservation Seed that's based out of Pennsylvania, and they have all kinds of resources on their website where they actually have seed per ounce or pound kind of written out. And so it is a bit of an art to come up with a mix that, one, has those 3 blooms per season, spring, summer, and fall, and then balance it out so that you're not too heavy on one species. You can't just say, okay, I'm going for 6 pounds, I'll do a half pound of each species. You want to know kind of based on the seed size and weight. They also have a lot of pre-made mixes available that kind of takes the guesswork out, but we just utilize, internal processes to kind of determine different seed mixes. We may have situations where we have a certain species on hand, and so we're taking that out. But Xerces has a spreadsheet. There's existing seed mixes to kind of get you started, these like conservation mixes that can be tailored to wet sites, dry sites, mesic sites. And that's really a good place to start because they've kind of done the work already of figuring out what your distribution is going to be between each species. So Xerces probably has a lot more resources available on that. And if I think of anything else, I will get that to Victoria to share with you.
Great, thanks so much. And just a last mention, in preamble to a bunch of the questions, most everybody is saying a big thank you and super interesting in this presentation. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Victoria, do you want to
Yes, I was just going to say the same thing. Thank you so much for your time and joining us today, Brittany. Your expertise is so beneficial, and I can tell by all the questions and the dialogue that we've received from our attendees that it's really going to be useful in the planning of new projects. Also very helpful to share those resources. And I also just want to give a little reminder to everyone who is still here with us that we do have our workshop coming up beginning on March 23rd. If you are interested in topics like this and you want to learn more, you can connect with us there, but you can also send us an email. And there you'll also have the opportunity to learn more about things in a Canadian context too. If you had a specific question about your community, we're also going to be having some people who are going to be sharing case studies from their own communities across Canada, not just in Eastern Ontario. That will be held on April 6th if you're interested. I also want to just acknowledge our funders, Ontario Children Foundation, for allowing this project to come to be. And again, thank you all for joining us. It's been a wonderful, wonderful day, and have a great day. Thank you.